Hello, and welcome to Bitesized Audio on YouTube. I'm Simon Stanhope, actor, audiobook narrator, and curator of this channel. On the channel you can hear my narrations, more than 100 to date, and more to come, of classic short stories, mostly from the Victorian and Edwardian eras, including vintage ghost stories, detective stories, and other classic tales of mystery and suspense. To accompany the narrations, I've put a short profile of the authors in the video description, as well as some general background notes on the stories for those who'd like to know more. If you enjoy this content, please hit subscribe, like, share, leave a comment if you'd like to, and thank you for listening. The Phantom Luncheon. "The Smithley Dubbs are in town," said Sir James. "I wish you would show them some attention. Ask them to lunch with you at the Ritz or somewhere." "From the little I've seen of the Smithley Dubbs, I don't think I want to cultivate their acquaintance," said Lady Drakmanton. "They always work for us at election times," said her husband. "I don't suppose they influence very many votes, but they have an uncle who is on one of my ward committees, and another uncle speaks sometimes at some of our less important meetings. Those sort of people expect some return in the shape of hospitality." "Expect it!" exclaimed Lady Drakmanton. "The Mrs. Smithley Dubb do more than that. They almost demand it. They belong to my club, and hang about the lobby just about lunch-time, all three of them, with their tongues hanging out of their mouths, and the six-course look in their eyes. If I were to breathe the word lunch, they would hustle me into a taxi and scream Ritz or Dieudonné's to the driver before I knew what was happening." "All the same, I think you ought to ask them to a meal of some sort," persisted Sir James. "I consider that showing hospitality to the Smithley Dubbs is carrying free food principles to a regrettable extreme," said Lady Drakmanton. "I've entertained the Joneses and the Browns and the Snapheimers and the Lubrikoffs and heaps of others whose names I forget, but I don't see why I should inflict the society of the Mrs. Smithley Dubb on myself for a solid hour. Imagine it, 60 minutes, more or less, of unrelenting gobble and gabble. Why can't you take them on, Milly?" she asked, turning hopefully to her sister. "I don't know them," said Milly hastily. "All the better. You can pass yourself off as me. People say that we are so alike that they can hardly tell us apart, and I've only spoken to these tiresome young women about twice in my life, at committee rooms, and bowed to them in the club. Any of the club page boys will point them out to you. They're always to be found lolling about the hall just before lunch-time." "My dear Betty, don't be absurd," protested Milly. "I've got some people lunching with me at the Carlton tomorrow, and I'm leaving town the day afterwards." "What time is your lunch tomorrow?" asked Lady Drakmanton, reflectively. 2 o'clock, said Milly. "Good," said her sister. "The Smithley Dubbs shall lunch with me tomorrow. It shall be rather an amusing lunch party. At least, I shall be amused." The last two remarks she made to herself. Other people did not always appreciate her ideas of humour. Sir James never did. The next day, Lady Drakmanton made some marked variations in her usual toilet effects. She dressed her hair in an unaccustomed manner, and put on a hat that added to the transformation of her appearance. When she had made 1 or 2 minor alterations, she was sufficiently unlike her usual smart self to produce some hesitation in the greeting which the Mrs. Smithly-Dubb bestowed on her in the club lobby. She responded, however, with a readiness which set their doubts at rest. "What is the Carlton like for lunching in?" she asked, breezily. The restaurant received an enthusiastic recommendation from the three sisters. "Let's go and lunch there, shall we?" she suggested, and in a few minutes' time the Smithly-Dubb mind was contemplating at close quarters a happy vista of baked meats and approved vintage. "Are you going to start with caviar?" "I am," confided Lady Drakmanton, and the Smithly-Dubbs started with caviar. The subsequent dishes were chosen in the same ambitious spirit, and by the time they had arrived at the wild duck course, it was beginning to be a rather expensive lunch. The conversation hardly kept pace with the brilliancy of the menu. Repeated references on the part of the guests to the local political conditions and prospects in Sir James's constituency were met with vague ahs and indeeds from Lady Drakmanton, who might have been expected to be specially interested. "I think when the Insurance Act is a little better understood, it will lose some of its present unpopularity," hazarded Cecilia Smithly-Dubb. "Will it? I dare say. I'm afraid politics don't interest me very much," said Lady Drakmanton. The three Miss Smithly-Dubbs put down their cups of Turkish coffee and stared. Then they broke into protesting giggles. "Of course you're joking," they said. "Not me," was the disconcerting answer. "I can't make head or tail of those bothering old politics. Never could, and never want to. I've quite enough to do to manage my own affairs, and that's a fact." "But," exclaimed Amanda Smithly-Dubb, with a squeal of bewilderment breaking into her voice, "I was told you spoke so informingly about the Insurance Act at one of our social evenings." It was Lady Drakmanton who stared now. "Do you know," she said, with a scared look around her, "rather a dreadful thing is happening. I'm suffering from a complete loss of memory. I can't even think who I am. I remember meeting you somewhere, and I remember you asking me to come and lunch with you here, and that I accepted your kind invitation. Beyond that, my mind is a positive blank." The scared look was transferred with intensified poignancy to the faces of her companions. "You asked us to lunch," they exclaimed hurriedly. That seemed a more immediately important point to clear up than the question of identity. "Oh, no," said the vanishing hostess. "That I do remember about. You insisted on my coming here because the feeding was so good, and I must say it comes up to all you said about it. A very nice lunch it's been. What I'm worrying about is who on earth am I? I haven't the faintest notion." "You are Lady Drakmanton," exclaimed the three sisters in chorus. "Now don't make fun of me," she replied crossly. "I happen to know her quite well by sight, and she isn't a bit like me. And it's an odd thing you should have mentioned her, for it so happens she's just come into the room. That lady in black, with the yellow plume in her hat, there, over by the door." The Smithly-Dubbs looked in the indicated direction, and the uneasiness in their eyes deepened into horror. In outward appearance, the lady who had just entered the room certainly came rather nearer to their recollection of their member's wife than the individual who was sitting at table with them. "Who are you, then, if that is Lady Drakmanton?" they asked, in panic-stricken bewilderment. "That is just what I don't know," was the answer, "and you don't seem to know much better than I do." "You came up to us in the club." "In what club?" "The New Didactic in Calais Street." "The New Didactic!" exclaimed Lady Drakmanton, with an air of returning illumination. "Thank you so much. Of course, I remember now who I am. I'm Ellen Niggle, of the Ladies' Brass Polishing Guild. The club employs me to come now and then to see to the polishing of the brass fittings. That's how I came to know Lady Drakmanton by sight. She's very often in the club. And you are the ladies who so kindly asked me out to lunch. Funny how it should all have slipped my memory, all of a sudden. The unaccustomed good food and wine must have been too much for me. For the moment, I really couldn't call to mind who I was. Good gracious!" She broke off suddenly. "It's 2:10. I should be at a polishing job in Whitehall. I must scuttle off like a giddy rabbit, thanking you ever so." She left the room with a scuttle sufficiently suggestive of the animal she had mentioned, but the giddiness was all on the side of her involuntary hostesses. The restaurant seemed to be spinning round them, and the bill, when it appeared, did nothing to restore their composure. They were as nearly in tears as it is permissible to be during the luncheon hour in a really good restaurant. Financially speaking, they were well able to afford the luxury of an elaborate lunch, but their ideas on the subject of entertaining differed very sharply according to the circumstances of whether they were dispensing or receiving hospitality. To have fed themselves liberally at their own expense was perhaps an extravagance to be deplored, but at any rate they had had something for their money. To have drawn an unknown and socially unremunerative Ellen Niggle into the net of their hospitality was a catastrophe that they could not contemplate with any degree of calmness. The Smithley Dubbs never quite recovered from their unnerving experience. They have given up politics and taken to doing good. The Seventh Pullet. "It's not the daily grind that I complain of," said Blenkinthrope resentfully. "It's the dull grey sameness of my life outside of office hours. Nothing of interest comes my way, nothing remarkable or out of the common. Even the little things that I do try to find some interest in don't seem to interest other people. Things in my garden, for instance." "The potato that weighed just over 2 pounds," said his friend Gorworth. "Did I tell you about that?" said Blenkinthrope. "I was telling the others in the train this morning. I forgot if I'd told you." "To be exact, you told me that it weighed just under 2 pounds, but I took into account the fact that abnormal vegetables and freshwater fish have an afterlife, in which growth is not arrested." "You're just like the others," said Blenkinthrope sadly. "You only make fun of it." "The fault is with the potato, not with us," said Gorworth. "We are not in the least interested in it, because it is not in the least interesting. The men you go up in the train with every day are just in the same case as yourself. Their lives are commonplace, and not very interesting to themselves, and they certainly are not going to wax enthusiastic over the commonplace events in other men's lives. Tell them something startling, dramatic, piquant that has happened to yourself or to someone in your family, and you will capture their interest at once. They will talk about you with a certain personal pride to all their acquaintances. Man I know intimately, fellow called Blenkinthrope, lives down my way, had 2 of his fingers clawed clean off by a lobster he was carrying home to supper. Doctor says entire hand may have to come off. Now that is conversation of a very high order. But imagine walking into a tennis club with the remark, 'I know a man who has grown a potato weighing 2¼ pounds.' "But hang it all, my dear fellow," said Blenkinthrope impatiently, "haven't I just told you that nothing of a remarkable nature ever happens to me?" "Invent something," said Gorworth. Since winning a prize for excellence in scriptural knowledge at a preparatory school, he had felt licensed to be a little more unscrupulous than the circle he moved in. Much might surely be excused to one who, in early life, could give a list of 17 trees mentioned in the Old Testament. "What sort of thing?" asked Blenkinthrope, somewhat snappishly. "A snake got into your hen-run yesterday morning and killed 6 out of 7 pullets, first mesmerising them with its eyes, and then biting them as they stood helpless. The 7th pullet was one of that French sort, with feathers all over its eyes, so it escaped the mesmeric snare, and just flew at what it could see of the snake, and pecked it to pieces." "Thank you," said Blenkinthrope, stiffly. "It's a very clever invention. If such a thing had really happened in my poultry run, I admit I should have been proud and interested to tell people about it. But I'd rather stick to fact, even if it is plain fact." All the same, his mind dwelt wistfully on the story of the 7th pullet. He could picture himself telling it in the train, amid the absorbed interest of his fellow passengers. Unconsciously, all sorts of little details and improvements began to suggest themselves. Wistfulness was still his dominant mood when he took his seat in the railway carriage the next morning. Opposite him sat Stevenham, who had attained to a recognised brevet of importance through the fact of an uncle having dropped dead in the act of voting at a parliamentary election. That had happened 3 years ago, but Stevenham was still deferred to on all questions of home and foreign politics. "Hallo! How's the giant mushroom, or whatever it was?" was all the notice Blenkinthrope got from his fellow travellers. Young Duckby, whom he mildly disliked, speedily monopolised the general attention by an account of a domestic bereavement. "Had 4 young pigeons carried off last night by a whacking big rat. Oh, a monster he must have been. You could tell by the size of the hole he made breaking into the loft." No moderate-sized rat ever seemed to carry out any predatory operations in these regions. They were all enormous in their enormity. "Pretty hard lines, that," continued Duckby, seeing that he had secured the attention and respect of the company. "4 squeakers carried off at one swoop. You'd find it rather hard to match that in the way of unlooked-for bad luck." "I had 6 pullets out of a pen of 7 killed by a snake yesterday afternoon," said Blenkinthrope, in a voice which he hardly recognised as his own. "By a snake?" came in excited chorus. "It fascinated them with its deadly glittering eyes, one after the other, and struck them down while they stood helpless. A bedridden neighbour, who wasn't able to call for assistance, witnessed it all from her bedroom window." "Well, I never!" broke in the chorus, with variations. "The interesting part of it is about the 7th pullet, the one that didn't get killed," resumed Blenkinthrope, slowly lighting a cigarette. His diffidence had left him, and he was beginning to realise how safe and easy depravity can seem once one has had the courage to begin. "The 6 dead birds were minorcas. The 7th was a houdan with a mop of feathers all over its eyes. It could hardly see the snake at all, so of course it wasn't mesmerised like the others. It just could see something wriggling on the ground, and went for it and pecked it to death." "Well, I'm blessed!" exclaimed the chorus. In the course of the next few days, Blenkinthrope discovered how little the loss of one's self-respect affects one when one has gained the esteem of the world. His story found its way into one of the poultry papers, and was copied thence into a daily news sheet as a matter of general interest. A lady wrote from the north of Scotland, recounting a similar episode which she had witnessed as occurring between a stoat and a blind grouse. Somehow, a lie seems so much less reprehensible when one can call it a lee. For a while, the adapter of the 7th pullet story enjoyed to the full his altered standing as a person of consequence, one who had had some share in the strange events of his times. Then he was thrust once again into the cold grey background by the sudden blossoming into importance of Smith Paddon, a daily fellow traveller, whose little girl had been knocked down and nearly hurt by a car belonging to a musical comedy actress. The actress was not in the car at the time, but she was in numerous photographs which appeared in the illustrated papers of Zoto Dobreen inquiring after the well-being of Maisie, daughter of Edmund Smith Paddon, Esquire. With this new human interest to absorb them, the travelling companions were almost rude when Blenkinthrope tried to explain his contrivance for keeping vipers and peregrine falcons out of his chicken run. Gorworth, to whom he unburdened himself in private, gave him the same counsel as heretofore. "Invent something." "Well, yes, but what?" The ready affirmative, coupled with the question, betrayed a significant shifting of the ethical standpoint. It was a few days later that Blenkinthrope revealed a chapter of family history to the customary gathering in the railway carriage. "Curious thing happened to my aunt, the one who lives in Paris," he began. He had several aunts, but they were all geographically distributed over Greater London. "She was sitting on a seat in the Bois the other afternoon, after lunching at the Romanian legation." Whatever the story gained in picturesqueness from the dragging in of diplomatic atmosphere, it ceased from that moment to command any acceptance as a record of current events. Gorworth had warned his neophyte that this would be the case, but the traditional enthusiasm of the neophyte had triumphed over discretion. "She was feeling rather drowsy, the effect probably of the champagne, which she's not in the habit of taking in the middle of the day." A subdued murmur of admiration went round the company. Blenkinthrope's aunts were not used to taking champagne in the middle of the year, regarding it exclusively as a Christmas and New Year accessory. Presently a rather portly gentleman passed by her seat and paused an instant to light a cigar. At that moment a youngish man came up behind him, drew the blade from a sword-stick, and stabbed him 6 times, through and through. "Scoundrel!" he cried to his victim, "you do not know me. My name is Henri Leturc." The elder man wiped away some of the blood that was spattering his clothes, turned to his assailant and said, "And since when has an attempted assassination been considered an introduction?" Then he finished lighting his cigar and walked away. My aunt had intended screaming for the police, but seeing the indifference with which the principal in the affair treated the matter, she felt that it would be an impertinence on her part to interfere. Of course, I need hardly say, she put the whole thing down to the effects of a warm, drowsy afternoon and the legation champagne. Now comes the astonishing part of my story. A fortnight later, a bank manager was stabbed to death with a sword-stick in that very part of the Bois. His assassin was the son of a charwoman formerly working at the bank, who had been dismissed from her job by the manager on account of chronic intemperance. His name was Henri Leturc. From that moment, Blenkinthrope was tacitly accepted as the Munchausen of the party. No effort was spared to draw him out from day to day in the exercise of testing their powers of credulity, and Blenkinthrope, in the false security of an assured and receptive audience, waxed industrious and ingenious in supplying the demand for marvels. Duckby's satirical story of a tame otter that had a tank in the garden to swim in and whined restlessly whenever the water rate was overdue was scarcely an unfair parody of some of Blenkinthrope's wilder efforts. And then, one day, came Nemesis. Returning to his villa one evening, Blenkinthrope found his wife sitting in front of a pack of cards, which she was scrutinizing with unusual concentration. "The same old patience game?" he asked carelessly. "No, dear, this is the death's head patience, the most difficult of them all. I've never got it to work out, and somehow I should be rather frightened if I did. Mother only got it out once in her life. She was afraid of it too. Her great-aunt had done it once, and fallen dead from excitement the next moment, and Mother always had a feeling that she would die if she ever got it out. She died the same night that she did it. She was in bad health at the time, certainly, but it was a strange coincidence. "Don't do it, if it frightens you," was Blenkinthrope's practical comment as he left the room. A few minutes later, his wife called to him. "John, it gave me such a turn. I nearly got it out. Only the 5 of diamonds held me up at the end. I really thought I'd done it." "Why, you can do it," said Blenkinthrope, who had come back to the room. "If you shift the 8 of clubs onto that open 9, the 5 can be moved onto the 6. His wife made the suggested move with hasty, trembling fingers, and piled the outstanding cards onto their respective packs. Then she followed the example of her mother and great-grand-aunt. Blenkinthrope had been genuinely fond of his wife, but in the midst of his bereavement one dominant thought obtruded itself. Something sensational and real had at last come into his life. No longer was it a grey, colourless record. The headlines which might appropriately describe his domestic tragedy kept shaping themselves in his brain. "Inherited presentiment comes true. The Death's Head Patience, card game that justified its sinister name in 3 generations." He wrote out a full story of the fatal occurrence for the Essex Vedette, the editor of which was a friend of his, and to another friend he gave a condensed account to be taken up to the office of one of the halfpenny dailies. But in both cases his reputation as a romancer stood fatally in the way of the fulfilment of his ambitions. "Not the right thing to be Munchausening in a time of sorrow," agreed his friends among themselves. And a brief note of regret at "the sudden death of the wife of our respected neighbour, Mr. John Blenkinthrope, from heart failure," appearing in the news column of the local paper, was the forlorn outcome of his visions of widespread publicity. Blenkinthrope shrank from the society of his erstwhile travelling companions, and took to travelling townwards by an earlier train. He sometimes tries to enlist the sympathy and attention of a chance acquaintance in details of the whistling prowess of his best canary, or the dimensions of his largest beetroot. He scarcely recognises himself as the man who was once spoken about and pointed out as the owner of the 7th pullet. The Recessional. Clovis sat in the hottest zone but 2 of a Turkish bath, alternately inert in statuesque contemplation and rapidly manoeuvring a fountain pen over the pages of a notebook. "Don't interrupt me with your childish prattle," he observed to Bertie Van Tahn, who had slung himself languidly into a neighbouring chair and looked conversationally inclined. "I'm writing deathless verse." Bertie looked interested. "I say, what a boon you would be to portrait painters if you really got to be notorious as a poetry writer. If they couldn't get your likeness hung in the Academy as Clovis Sangrail, Esquire, at work on his latest poem, they could slip you in as a study of the nude, or Orpheus descending into Jermyn Street. They always complain that modern dress handicaps them, whereas a towel and a fountain pen—" "It was Mrs. Packletide's suggestion that I should write this thing," said Clovis, ignoring the bypaths to fame that Bertie Van Tahn was pointing out to him. "You see, Luna Bimberton had a coronation ode accepted by the New Infancy, a paper that has been started with the idea of making the New Age seem elderly and hidebound." "So clever of you, dear Luna," the Packletide remarked when she had read it. "Of course, anyone could write a coronation ode, but no one else would have thought of doing it." Luna protested that these things were extremely difficult to do, and gave us to understand that they were more or less the province of a gifted few. Now, the Packletide has been rather decent to me in many ways, a sort of financial ambulance, you know, that carries you off the field when you're hard hit, which is a frequent occurrence with me, and I've no use whatever for Luna Bimberton. So I chipped in and said I could turn out that sort of stuff by the square yard if I gave my mind to it. Luna said I couldn't, and we got bets on, and between you and me, I think the money's fairly safe. Of course, one of the conditions of the wager is that the thing has to be published in something or other, local newspapers barred. But Mrs. Packletide has endeared herself by many little acts of thoughtfulness to the editor of the Smoky Chimney, so if I can hammer out anything at all approaching the level of the usual ode output, we ought to be all right. So far I'm getting along so comfortably that I begin to be afraid that I must be one of the gifted few. "It's rather late in the day for a coronation ode, isn't it?" said Bertie. "Of course," said Clovis. "This is going to be a Durbar recessional, the sort of thing that you can keep by you for all time, if you want to." "Now I understand your choice of a place to write it in," said Bertie Van Tahn, with the air of one who has suddenly unravelled a hitherto obscure problem. "You want to get the local temperature." "I came here to get freedom from the inane interruptions of the mentally deficient," said Clovis, "but it seems I asked too much of fate." Bertie Van Tahn prepared to use his towel as a weapon of precision, but reflecting that he had a good deal of unprotected coastline himself, and that Clovis was equipped with a fountain pen as well as a towel, he relapsed pacifically into the depths of his chair. "May one hear extracts from the immortal work?" he asked. "I promise that nothing that I hear now shall prejudice me against borrowing a copy of the Smoky Chimney at the right moment." "It's rather like casting pearls into a trough," remarked Clovis pleasantly, "but I don't mind reading you bits of it. It begins with a general dispersal of the Durbar participants. Back to their homes in Himalayan heights, the stale, pale elephants of Cooch Behar roll like great galleons on a tideless sea." "I don't believe Cooch Behar is anywhere near the Himalayan region," interrupted Bertie. "You ought to have an atlas on hand when you do this sort of thing. And why stale and pale?" "After the late hours and the excitement, of course," said Clovis. "And I said their homes were in the Himalayas. You can have Himalayan elephants in Cooch Behar, I suppose, just as you have Irish-bred horses running at Ascot." "You said they were going back to the Himalayas," objected Bertie. "Well, they would naturally be sent home to recuperate. It's the usual thing out there to turn elephants loose in the hills, just as we put horses out to grass in this country." Clovis could at least flatter himself that he had infused some of the reckless splendour of the East into his mendacity. "Is it all going to be in blank verse?" asked the critic. "Of course not. Durbar comes at the end of the fourth line." "That seems so cowardly. However, it explains why you pitched on Cooch Behar." "There is more connection between geographical place names and poetical inspiration than is generally recognized. One of the chief reasons why there are so few really great poems about Russia in our language is that you can't possibly get a rhyme to names like Smolensk and Tobolsk and Minsk." Clovis spoke with the authority of one who has tried. "Of course you could rhyme Omsk with Tomsk," he continued. "In fact, they seem to be there for that purpose, but the public wouldn't stand that sort of thing indefinitely." "The public will stand a good deal," said Bertie malevolently, "and so small a proportion of it knows Russian that you could always have an explanatory footnote asserting that the last three letters in Smolensk are not pronounced. It's quite as believable as your statement about putting elephants out to grass in the Himalayan range." "I've got rather a nice bit," resumed Clovis with unruffled serenity, "giving an evening scene on the outskirts of a jungle village, where the coiled cobra in the gloaming gloats, and prowling panthers stalk the wary goats." "There is practically no gloaming in tropical countries," said Bertie indulgently, "but I like the masterly reticence with which you treat the cobra's motive for gloating. The unknown is proverbially the uncanny. I can picture nervous readers of the smoky chimney keeping the light turned on in their bedrooms all night, out of sheer sickening uncertainty as to what the cobra might have been gloating about. "Cobras gloat naturally," said Clovis, "just as wolves are always ravening from mere force of habit, even after they've hopelessly overeaten themselves. I've got a fine bit of colour painting later on," he added, "where I describe the dawn coming up over the Brahmaputra river. The amber dawn drenched east, with sun-shafts kissed, stained sanguine apricot and amethyst, o'er the washed emerald of the mango groves, hangs in a mist of opalescent mauves, while painted parrot flights impinge the haze with scarlet, chalcedon, and chrysoprase." "I've never seen the dawn come up over the Brahmaputra river," said Bertie, "so I can't say if it's a good description of the event, but it sounds more like an account of an extensive jewel robbery. Anyhow, the parrots give a good useful touch of local colour. I suppose you've introduced some tigers into the scenery. An Indian landscape would have rather a bare, unfinished look without a tiger or two in the middle distance." "I've got a hen tiger somewhere in the poem," said Clovis, hunting through his notes. "Here she is. The tawny tigress, mid the tangled teak, drags to her purring cubs enraptured ears the harsh death-rattle in the pea-fowl's beak, a jungle lullaby of blood and tears." Bertie Van Tahn rose hurriedly from his recumbent position and made for the glass door leading into the next compartment. "I think your idea of home life in the jungle is perfectly horrid," he said. "The cobra was sinister enough, but the improvised rattle in the tiger nursery is the limit. If you're going to make me turn hot and cold all over, I may as well go into the steam room at once." "Just listen to this line," said Clovis. "It would make the reputation of any ordinary poet. And overhead, the pendulum-patient punkah, parent of still-born breeze." Most of your readers will think punkah is a kind of iced drink, or half-time at polo, said Bertie, and disappeared into the steam. The smoky chimney duly published the recessional, but it proved to be its swan song, for the paper never attained to another issue. Luna Bimberton gave up her intention of attending the Durbar, and went into a nursing home on the Sussex Downs. Nervous breakdown, after a particularly strenuous season, was the usually accepted explanation, but there are 3 or 4 people who know that she never really recovered from the dawn breaking over the Brahmaputra river. Mrs. Packletide's Tiger. It was Mrs. Packletide's pleasure and intention that she should shoot a tiger. Not that the lust to kill had suddenly descended on her, or that she felt that she would leave India safer and more wholesome than she had found it, with 1 fraction less of wild beast per million of inhabitants. The compelling motive for her sudden deviation towards the footsteps of Nimrod was the fact that Luna Bimberton had recently been carried 11 miles in an aeroplane by an Algerian aviator, and talked of nothing else. Only a personally procured tiger skin and a heavy harvest of press photographs could successfully counter that sort of thing. Mrs. Packletide had already arranged in her mind the lunch she would give at her house in Curzon Street, ostensibly in Luna Bimberton's honour, with a tiger-skin rug occupying most of the foreground and all of the conversation. She had also already designed in her mind the tiger-claw brooch that she was going to give Luna Bimberton on her next birthday. In a world that is supposed to be chiefly swayed by hunger and by love, Mrs. Packletide was an exception. Her movements and motives were largely governed by dislike of Luna Bimberton. Circumstances proved propitious. Mrs. Packletide had offered 1,000 rupees for the opportunity of shooting a tiger without overmuch risk or exertion, and it so happened that a neighbouring village could boast of being the favoured rendezvous of an animal of respectable antecedents, which had been driven by the increasing infirmities of age to abandon game-killing and confine its appetite to the smaller domestic animals. The prospect of earning the 1,000 rupees had stimulated the sporting and commercial instinct of the villagers. Children were posted night and day on the outskirts of the local jungle to head the tiger back in the unlikely event of his attempting to roam away to fresh hunting grounds, and the cheaper kind of goats were left about with elaborate carelessness to keep him satisfied with his present quarters. The one great anxiety was lest he should die of old age before the date appointed for the Memsahib's shoot. Mothers carrying their babies home through the jungle after the day's work in the fields hushed their singing, lest they might curtail the restful sleep of the venerable herd-robber. The great night duly arrived, moonlit and cloudless. A platform had been constructed in a comfortable and conveniently placed tree, and thereon crouched Mrs. Packletide and her paid companion, Miss Mebbin. A goat, gifted with a particularly persistent bleat, such as even a partially deaf tiger might be reasonably expected to hear on a still night, was tethered at the correct distance. With an accurately sighted rifle and a thumbnail pack of patience cards, the sportswoman awaited the coming of the quarry. "I suppose we are in some danger," said Miss Mebbin. She was not actually nervous about the wild beast, but she had a morbid dread of performing an atom more service than she had been paid for. "Nonsense," said Mrs. Packletide. "It's a very old tiger. It couldn't spring up here, even if it wanted to." "If it's an old tiger, I think you ought to get it cheaper. 1,000 rupees is a lot of money." Louisa Mebbin adopted a protective elder sister attitude towards money in general, irrespective of nationality or denomination. Her energetic intervention had saved many a rouble from dissipating itself in tips in some Moscow hotel, and francs and centimes clung to her instinctively, under circumstances which would have driven them headlong from less sympathetic hands. Her speculations as to the market depreciation of tiger remnants were cut short by the appearance on the scene of the animal itself. As soon as it caught sight of the tethered goat, it lay flat on the earth, seemingly less from a desire to take advantage of all available cover than for the purpose of snatching a short rest before commencing the grand attack. "I believe it's ill," said Louisa Mebbin, loudly in Hindustani, for the benefit of the village headman, who was in ambush in a neighbouring tree. "Hush!" said Mrs. Packletide, and at that moment the tiger commenced ambling towards his victim. "Now, now!" urged Miss Mebbin, with some excitement. "If he doesn't touch the goat, we needn't pay for it." The bait was an extra. The rifle flashed out with a loud report, and the great tawny beast sprang to one side, and then rolled over in the stillness of death. In a moment a crowd of excited natives had swarmed onto the scene, and their shouting speedily carried the glad news to the village, where a thumping of tom-toms took up the chorus of triumph. And their triumph and rejoicing found a ready echo in the heart of Mrs. Packletide. Already that luncheon party in Curzon Street seemed immeasurably nearer. It was Louisa Mebbin who drew attention to the fact that the goat was in death throes from a mortal bullet wound, while no trace of the rifle's deadly work could be found on the tiger. Evidently the wrong animal had been hit, and the beast of prey had succumbed to heart failure, caused by the sudden report of the rifle, accelerated by senile decay. Mrs. Packletide was pardonably annoyed at the discovery, but at any rate she was the possessor of a dead tiger, and the villagers, anxious for their 1,000 rupees, gladly connived at the fiction that she had shot the beast. And Miss Mebbin was a paid companion. Therefore did Mrs. Packletide face the cameras with a light heart, and her pictured fame reached from the pages of the Texas Weekly Snapshot to the Illustrated Monday supplement of the Novo Vremya. As for Luna Bimberton, she refused to look at an illustrated paper for weeks, and her letter of thanks for the gift of a tiger claw brooch was a model of repressed emotions. The luncheon party she declined. There are limits beyond which repressed emotions become dangerous. From Curzon Street, the tiger-skin rug travelled down to the Manor House, and was duly inspected and admired by the county, and it seemed a fitting and appropriate thing when Mrs. Packletide went to the county costume ball in the character of Diana. She refused to fall in, however, with Clovis's tempting suggestion of a primeval dance party, at which everyone should wear the skins of beasts they had recently slain. "I should be in rather a baby bunting condition," confessed Clovis, "with a miserable rabbit skin or two to wrap up in. But then," he added, with a rather malicious glance at Diana's proportions, "my figure is quite as good as that Russian dancing boy's." "How amused everyone would be if they knew what really happened," said Louisa Mebbin a few days after the ball. "What do you mean?" asked Mrs. Packletide quickly. "How you shot the goat and frightened the tiger to death," said Miss Mebbin, with her disagreeably pleasant laugh. "No one would believe it," said Mrs. Packletide, her face changing colour as rapidly as though it were going through a book of patterns before post-time. "Luna Bimberton would," said Miss Mebbin. Mrs. Packletide's face settled on an unbecoming shade of greenish-white. "You surely wouldn't give me away?" she asked. "I've seen a week-end cottage near Dorking that I should rather like to buy," said Miss Mebbin, with seeming irrelevance. "680 freehold. Quite a bargain, only I don't happen to have the money." Louisa Mebbin's pretty week-end cottage, christened by her Les Fauves, and gay in summer-time with its garden borders of tiger lilies, is the wonder and admiration of her friends. "It is a marvel how Louisa manages to do it," is the general verdict. Mrs. Packletide indulges in no more big game shooting. "The incidental expenses are so heavy," she confides to inquiring friends. The Schatz-Metterklumer method. Lady Carlotta stepped out onto the platform of the small wayside station and took a turn or two up and down its uninteresting length, to kill time till the train should be pleased to proceed on its way. Then, in the roadway beyond, she saw a horse struggling with a more than ample load, and a carter of the sort that seems to bear a sullen hatred against the animal that helps him to earn a living. Lady Carlotta promptly betook her to the roadway, and put rather a different complexion on the struggle. Certain of her acquaintances were wont to give her plentiful admonition as to the undesirability of interfering on behalf of a distressed animal, such interference being none of her business. Only once had she put the doctrine of non-interference into practice, when one of its most eloquent exponents had been besieged for nearly 3 hours in a small and extremely uncomfortable may-tree by an angry boar pig, while Lady Carlotta, on the other side of the fence, had proceeded with the watercolour sketch she was engaged on, and refused to interfere between the boar and his prisoner. It is to be feared that she lost the friendship of the ultimately rescued lady. On this occasion, she merely lost the train, which gave way to the first sign of impatience it had shown throughout the journey, and steamed off without her. She bore the desertion with philosophical indifference. Her friends and relations were thoroughly well used to the fact of her luggage arriving without her, She wired a vague, non-committal message to her destination to say that she was coming on by another train. Before she had time to think what her next move might be, she was confronted by an imposingly attired lady, who seemed to be taking a prolonged mental inventory of her clothes and looks. "You must be Miss Hope, the governess I've come to meet," said the apparition, in a tone that admitted of very little argument. "Very well, if I must, I must," said Lady Carlotta to herself, with dangerous meekness. "I am Mrs. Quabarl," continued the lady. "And where, pray, is your luggage?" "It's gone astray," said the alleged governess, falling in with the excellent rule of life that the absent are always to blame. The luggage had, in point of fact, behaved with perfect correctitude. "I've just telegraphed about it," she added, with a nearer approach to truth. "How provoking," said Mrs. Quabarl. "These railway companies are so careless. However, my maid can lend you things for the night." And she led the way to her car. During the drive to the Quabarl mansion, Lady Carlotta was impressively introduced to the nature of the charge that had been thrust upon her. She learned that Claude and Wilfred were delicate, sensitive young people, that Irene had the artistic temperament highly developed, and that Viola was something or other else of a mould equally commonplace among children of that class and type in the 20th century. "I wish them not only to be taught," said Mrs. Quabarl, "but interested in what they learn. In their history lessons, for instance, you must try to make them feel that they are being introduced to the life stories of men and women who really lived, not merely committing a mass of names and dates to memory. French, of course, I shall expect you to talk at meal-times several days in the week." "I shall talk French 4 days of the week, and Russian in the remaining 3. "Russian? My dear Miss Hope, no one in the house speaks or understands Russian." "That will not embarrass me in the least," said Lady Carlotta coldly. Mrs. Quabarl, to use a colloquial expression, was knocked off her perch. She was one of those imperfectly self-assured individuals who are magnificent and autocratic as long as they are not seriously opposed. The least show of unexpected resistance goes a long way towards rendering them cowed and apologetic. When the new governess failed to express wondering admiration of the large, newly purchased, and expensive car, and lightly alluded to the superior advantages of 1 or 2 makes which had just been put on the market, the discomfiture of her patroness became almost abject. Her feelings were those which might have animated a general of ancient warfaring days, on beholding his heaviest battle elephant ignominiously driven off the field by slingers and javelin-throwers. At dinner that evening, although reinforced by her husband, who usually duplicated her opinions and lent her moral support generally, Mrs. Quabarl regained none of her lost ground. The governess not only helped herself well and truly to wine, but held forth with considerable show of critical knowledge on various vintage matters, concerning which the Quabarls were in no wise able to pose as authorities. Previous governesses had limited their conversation on the wine topic to a respectful and doubtless sincere expression of a preference for water. When this one went as far as to recommend a wine firm in whose hands you could not go very far wrong, Mrs. Quabarl thought it time to turn the conversation into more usual channels. "We got very satisfactory references about you from Canon Teep," she observed. "A very estimable man, I should think. Drinks like a fish and beats his wife, otherwise a very lovable character," said the governess imperturbably. "My dear Miss Hope, I trust you are exaggerating," exclaimed the Quabarls in unison. "One must in justice admit that there is some provocation," continued the romancer. "Mrs. Teep is quite the most irritating bridge player that I have ever sat down with. Her leads and declarations would condone a certain amount of brutality in her partner, but to souse her with the contents of the only soda-water siphon in the house on a Sunday afternoon, when one couldn't get another, argues an indifference to the comfort of others, which I cannot altogether overlook. You may think me hasty in my judgments, but it was practically on account of the siphon incident that I left." "We will talk of this some other time," said Mrs. Quabarl hastily. "I shall never allude to it again," said the governess, with decision. Mr. Quabarl made a welcome diversion by asking what studies the new instructress proposed to inaugurate on the morrow. "History, to begin with," she informed him. "Ah, history," he observed sagely. "Now, in teaching them history, you must take care to interest them in what they learn. You must make them feel that they are being introduced to the life stories of men and women who really lived." "I've told her all that," interposed Mrs. Quabarl. "I teach history on the H.H.Munro method," said the governess loftily. "Ah, yes," said her listeners, thinking it expedient to assume an acquaintance at least with the name. "What are you children doing out here?" demanded Mrs. Quabarl the next morning, on finding Irene sitting rather glumly at the head of the stairs, while her sister was perched in an attitude of depressed discomfort on the window-seat behind her, with a wolf-skin rug almost covering her. "We are having a history lesson," came the unexpected reply. "I am supposed to be Rome, and Viola up there is the she-wolf. Not a real wolf, but the figure of one that the Romans used to set store by. I forget why. Claude and Wilfrid have gone to fetch the shabby women." "The shabby women?" "Yes, they've got to carry them off. They didn't want to, but Miss Hope got one of Father's fives bats and said she'd give them a number 9 spanking if they didn't, so they've gone to do it." A loud, angry screaming from the direction of the lawn drew Mrs. Quabarl thither in hot haste, fearful lest the threatened castigation might even now be in process of infliction. The outcry, however, came principally from the 2 small daughters of the lodge-keeper, who were being hauled and pushed towards the house by the panting and dishevelled Claude and Wilfrid, whose task was rendered even more arduous by the incessant, if not very effectual, attacks of the captured maiden's small brother. The governess, fives-bat in hand, sat negligently on the stone balustrade, presiding over the scene with the cold impartiality of a goddess of battles. A furious and repeated chorus of "I'll tell mother" rose from the lodge children, but the lodge mother, who was hard of hearing, was for the moment immersed in the preoccupation of her wash-tub. After an apprehensive glance in the direction of the lodge, the good woman was gifted with the highly militant temper which is sometimes the privilege of deafness. Mrs. Quabarl flew indignantly to the rescue of the struggling captives. "Wilfrid, Claude, let those children go at once. Miss Hope, what on earth is the meaning of this scene?" "Early Roman history. The Sabine women, don't you know? It's the H.H.Munro method to make children understand history by acting it themselves. Fixes it in their memory, you know. Of course, if, thanks to your interference, your boys go through life thinking that the Sabine women ultimately escaped, I really cannot be held responsible." "You may be very clever and modern, Miss Hope," said Mrs. Quabarl firmly, "but I should like you to leave here by the next train. Your luggage will be sent after you as soon as it arrives." "I'm not certain exactly where I shall be for the next few days," said the dismissed instructress of youth. "You might keep my luggage till I wire my address. There are only a couple of trunks, and some golf clubs, and a leopard cub." "A leopard cub?" gasped Mrs. Quabarl. Even in her departure, this extraordinary person seemed destined to leave a trail of embarrassment behind her. "Well, it's rather left off being a cub. It's more than half grown, you know. A fowl every day and a rabbit on Sundays is what it usually gets. Raw beef makes it too excitable. Don't trouble about getting the car for me. I'm rather inclined for a walk." And Lady Carlotta strode out of the Quabarl horizon. The advent of the genuine Miss Hope who had made a mistake as to the day on which she was due to arrive, caused a turmoil which that good lady was quite unused to inspiring. Obviously the Quabarl family had been woefully befooled, but a certain amount of relief came with the knowledge. "How very tiresome for you, dear Carlotta," said her hostess, when the overdue guest ultimately arrived. "How very tiresome, losing your train and having to stop overnight in a strange place." "Oh dear, no," said Lady Carlotta. "Not at all tiresome, for me." The disappearance of Crispina Umberleigh. In a first-class carriage of a train speeding Balkanward across the flat, green Hungarian plain, two Britons sat in friendly, fitful converse. They had first foregathered in the cold grey dawn at the frontier line, where the presiding eagle takes on an extra head, and Teuton lands pass from Hohenzollern to Habsburg keeping, and where a probing official beak requires to delve in polite and perhaps perfunctory, but always tiresome manner, into the baggage of sleep-hungry passengers. After a day's break of their journey at Vienna, the travellers had again foregathered at the train-side, and paid one another the compliment of settling instinctively into the same carriage. The elder of the two had the appearance and manner of a diplomat. In point of fact, he was the well-connected foster-brother of a wine business. The other was certainly a journalist. Neither man was talkative, and each was grateful to the other for not being talkative. That is why, from time to time, they talked. One topic of conversation naturally thrust itself forward in front of all others. In Vienna the previous day, they had learned of the mysterious vanishing of a world-famous picture from the walls of the Louvre. "A dramatic disappearance of that sort is sure to produce a crop of imitations," said the journalist. "It has had a lot of anticipations, for the matter of that," said the wine-brother. "Oh, of course, there have been thefts from the Louvre before." "I was thinking of the spiriting away of human beings rather than pictures. In particular, I was thinking of the case of my aunt, Crispina Umberleigh." "I remember hearing something of the affair," said the journalist, "but I was away from England at the time. I never quite knew what was supposed to have happened." "You may hear what really happened, if you will respect it as a confidence," said the wine merchant. "In the first place, I may say that the disappearance of Mrs. Umberleigh was not regarded by the family entirely as a bereavement. My uncle, Edward Umberleigh, was not by any means a weak-kneed individual. In fact, in the world of politics he had to be reckoned with more or less as a strong man. But he was unmistakably dominated by Crispina. Indeed, I never met any human being who was not frozen into subjection when brought into prolonged contact with her. Some people are born to command. Crispina, Mrs. Umberleigh, was born to legislate, codify, administrate, censor, license, ban, execute, and sit in judgment generally. If she was not born with that destiny, she adopted it at an early age. From the kitchen regions upwards, everyone in the household came under her despotic sway, and stayed there with the submissiveness of molluscs involved in a glacial epoch. As a nephew, on a footing of only occasional visits, she affected me merely as an epidemic, disagreeable while it lasted, but without any permanent effect. But her own sons and daughters stood in mortal awe of her. Their studies, friendships, diet, amusements, religious observances, and way of doing their hair were all regulated and ordained according to the august lady's will and pleasure. This will help you to understand the sensation of stupefaction which was caused in the family when she unobtrusively and inexplicably vanished. It was as though St. Paul's Cathedral, or the Piccadilly Hotel had disappeared in the night, leaving nothing but an open space to mark where it had stood. As far as was known, nothing was troubling her. In fact, there was much before her to make life particularly well worth living. The youngest boy had come back from school with an unsatisfactory report, and she was to have sat in judgment on him the very afternoon of the day she disappeared. If it had been he who had vanished in a hurry, one could have supplied the motive. Then she was in the middle of a newspaper correspondence with a rural dean, in which she had already proved him guilty of heresy, inconsistency, and unworthy quibbling, and no ordinary consideration would have induced her to discontinue the controversy. Of course, the matter was put in the hands of the police, but as far as possible it was kept out of the papers, and the generally accepted explanation of her withdrawal from her social circle was that she had gone into a nursing home. "And what was the immediate effect on the home circle?" asked the journalist. All the girls bought themselves bicycles. The feminine cycling craze was still in existence, and Crispina had rigidly vetoed any participation in it among the members of her household. The youngest boy let himself go to such an extent during his next term that it had to be his last, as far as that particular establishment was concerned. The elder boys propounded a theory that their mother might be wandering somewhere abroad, and searched for her assiduously, chiefly, it must be admitted, in a class of Montmartre resort where it was extremely improbable that she would be found. "And all this while, couldn't your uncle get hold of the least clue?" "As a matter of fact, he had received some information, though of course I did not know of it at the time. He got a message one day telling him that his wife had been kidnapped and smuggled out of the country. She was said to be hidden away in one of the islands off the coast of Norway, I think it was, in comfortable surroundings and well cared for. And with the information came a demand for money. A lump sum of £2,000 was to be paid yearly. Failing this, she would be immediately restored to her family." The journalist was silent for a moment, and then began to laugh quietly. "It was certainly an inverted form of holding to ransom," he said. "If you had known my aunt," said the wine merchant, "you would have wondered that they didn't put the figure higher." "I realize the temptation. Did your uncle succumb to it?" "Well, you see, he had to think of others as well as himself. For the family to have gone back into the Crispina thraldom after having tasted the delights of liberty would have been a tragedy, and there were even wider considerations to be taken into account. Since his bereavement, he had unconsciously taken up a far bolder and more initiatory line in public affairs, and his popularity and influence had increased correspondingly. From being merely a strong man in the political world, he began to be spoken of as the strong man. All this he knew would be jeopardized if he once more dropped into the social position of the husband of Mrs. Umberley. He was a rich man, and the £2,000 a year, though not exactly a flea-bite, did not seem an extravagant price to pay for the boarding out of Crispina. Of course, he had severe qualms of conscience about the arrangement. Later on, when he took me into his confidence, he told me that in paying the ransom, or hush-money, as I should have called it, he was partly influenced by the fear that if he refused it, the kidnappers might have vented their rage and disappointment on their captive. It was better, he said, to think of her being well cared for as a highly valued paying guest in one of the Lofoden Islands, than to have her struggling miserably home in a maimed and mutilated condition. Anyway, he paid the yearly instalment as punctually as one pays a fire insurance, and with equal promptitude there would come an acknowledgment of the money and a brief statement to the effect that Crispina was in good health and fairly cheerful spirits. One report even mentioned that she was busying herself with a scheme for proposed reforms in church management to be pressed on the local pastorate. Another spoke of a rheumatic attack and a journey to a cure on the mainland, and on that occasion an additional £80 was demanded and conceded. Of course, it was to the interest of the kidnappers to keep their charge in good health, but the secrecy with which they managed to shroud their arrangements argued a really wonderful organisation. If my uncle was paying a rather high price, at least he could console himself with the reflection that he was paying specialists' fees. "Meanwhile, had the police given up all attempts to track the missing lady?" asked the journalist. "Not entirely. They came to my uncle from time to time to report on clues which they thought might yield some elucidation as to her fate or whereabouts, but I think they had their suspicions that he was possessed of more information than he had put at their disposal. And then, after a disappearance of more than 8 years, Crispina returned with dramatic suddenness to the home she had left so mysteriously." "She had given her captors the slip?" "She had never been captured. Her wandering away had been caused by a sudden and complete loss of memory. She usually dressed rather in the style of a superior kind of charwoman, and it was not so very surprising that she should have imagined that she was one, and still less that people should accept her statement and help her to get work. She had wandered as far afield as Birmingham, and found fairly steady employment there, her energy and enthusiasm in putting people's rooms in order counterbalancing her obstinate and domineering characteristics. It was the shock of being patronizingly addressed as "my good woman" by a curate who was disputing with her where the stove should be placed in a parish concert hall that led to the sudden restoration of her memory. "I think you forget who you are speaking to," she observed crushingly, which was rather unduly severe, considering she had only just remembered it herself. "But," exclaimed the journalist, the Lofoden Island people, who had they got hold of?" "A purely mythical prisoner. It was an attempt, in the first place, by someone who knew something of the domestic situation, probably a discharged valet, to bluff a lump sum out of Edward Umberley before the missing woman turned up. The subsequent yearly instalments were an unlooked-for increment to the original haul. Crispina found that the 8 years' interregnum had materially weakened her ascendancy over her now grown-up offspring. Her husband, however, never accomplished anything great in the political world after her return. The strain of trying to account satisfactorily for an unspecified expenditure of £16,000 spread over 8 years sufficiently occupied his mental energies. Here is Belgrade and another custom house. The Easter egg. It was distinctly hard lines for Lady Barbara, who came of good fighting stock, and was one of the bravest women of her generation, that her son should be so undisguisedly a coward. Whatever good qualities Lester Slagby may have possessed, and he was in some respects charming, courage could certainly never be imputed to him. As a child he had suffered from childish timidity, as a boy from unboyish funk, and as a youth he had exchanged unreasoning fears for others which were more formidable from the fact of having a carefully thought-out basis. He was frankly afraid of animals, nervous with firearms, and never crossed the Channel without mentally comparing the numerical proportion of life-belts to passengers. On horseback he seemed to require as many hands as a Hindu god, at least 4 for clutching the reins, and 2 more for patting the horse soothingly on the neck. Lady Barbara no longer pretended not to see her son's prevailing weakness. With her usual courage, she faced the knowledge of it squarely, and, mother-like, loved him none the less. Continental travel, anywhere away from the great tourist tracks, was a favourite hobby with Lady Barbara, and Leicester joined her as often as possible. Eastertide usually found her at Nobletime, an upland township in one of those small princedoms that make inconspicuous freckles on the map of Central Europe. A long-standing acquaintanceship with the reigning family made her a personage of due importance in the eyes of her old friend, the burgomaster, and she was anxiously consulted by that worthy on the momentous occasion when the prince made known his intention of coming in person to open a sanatorium outside the town. All the usual items in a programme of welcome, some of them fatuous and commonplace, others quaint and charming, had been arranged for. But the burgomaster hoped that the resourceful English lady might have something new and tasteful to suggest in the way of loyal greeting. The prince was known to the outside world, if at all, as an old-fashioned reactionary, combating modern progress, as it were, with a wooden sword. To his own people he was known as a kindly old gentleman, with a certain endearing stateliness which had nothing of standoffishness about it. Nobletime was anxious to do its best. Lady Barbara discussed the matter with Leicester and one or two acquaintances in her little hotel, but ideas were difficult to come by. "Might I suggest something to the gnädige Frau?" asked a sallow, high-cheek-boned lady to whom the Englishwoman had spoken once or twice, and whom she had set down in her mind as probably a southern Slav. "Might I suggest something for the reception fest?" she went on, with a certain shy eagerness. "Our little child here, our baby, we will dress him in a little white coat, with small wings, as an Easter angel, and he will carry a large white Easter egg, and inside shall be a basket of plover eggs, of which the prince is so fond, and he shall give it to his highness as Easter offering. It is so pretty an idea. We have seen it done once in Styria." Lady Barbara looked dubiously at the proposed Easter angel, a fair, wooden-faced child of about 4 years old. She had noticed it the day before in the hotel, and wondered rather how such a tow-headed child could belong to such a dark-visaged couple as the woman and her husband. Probably, she thought, an adopted baby, especially as the couple were not young. "Of course, gnädige Frau will escort the little child up to the prince," pursued the woman, "but he will be quite good, and do as he is told." "We have some plover's eggs, shall come fresh from Wien," said the husband. The small child and Lady Barbara seemed equally unenthusiastic about the pretty idea. Leicester was openly discouraging, but when the burgomaster heard of it, he was enchanted. The combination of sentiment and plover's eggs appealed strongly to his Teutonic mind. On the eventful day, the Easter angel, really quite prettily and quaintly dressed, was a centre of kindly interest to the gala crowd marshalled to receive His Highness. The mother was unobtrusive and less fussy than most parents would have been under the circumstances, merely stipulating that she should place the Easter egg herself in the arms that had been carefully schooled how to hold the precious burden. Then Lady Barbara moved forward, the child marching stolidly and with grim determination at her side. It had been promised cakes and sweeties galore, if it gave the egg well and truly to the kind old gentleman who was waiting to receive it. Leicester had tried to convey to it privately that horrible smackings would attend any failure in its share of the proceedings, but it is doubtful if his German caused more than an immediate distress. Lady Barbara had thoughtfully provided herself with an emergency supply of chocolate sweetmeats. Children may sometimes be time-servers, but they do not encourage long accounts. As they approached nearer to the princely dais, Lady Barbara stood discreetly aside, and the stolid-faced infant walked forward alone, with staggering but steadfast gait, encouraged by a murmur of elderly approval. Leicester, standing in the front row of the onlookers, turned to scan the crowd for the beaming faces of the happy parents. In a side road, which led to the railway station, he saw a cab. Entering the cab with every appearance of furtive haste were the dark-visaged couple who had been so plausibly eager for the pretty idea. The sharpened instinct of cowardice lit up the situation to him in one swift flash. The blood roared and surged to his head, as though thousands of floodgates had been opened in his veins and arteries, and his brain was the common sluice in which all the torrents met. He saw nothing but a blur around him. Then the blood ebbed away in quick waves, till his very heart seemed drained and empty, and he stood nervelessly, helplessly, dumbly watching the child, bearing its accursed burden with slow, relentless steps, nearer and nearer to the group that waited sheep-like to receive him. A fascinated curiosity compelled Leicester to turn his head towards the fugitives. The cab had started at hot pace in the direction of the station. The next moment, Leicester was running faster than any of those present had ever seen a man run. And he was not running away. For that stray fraction of his life, some unwonted impulse beset him, some hint of the stock he came from, and he ran unflinchingly towards danger. He stooped and clutched at the Easter egg, as one tries to scoop up the ball in rugby football. What he meant to do with it he had not considered. The thing was to get it. But the child had been promised cakes and sweetmeats if it safely gave the egg into the hands of the kindly old gentleman. It uttered no scream, but it held to its charge with limpet grip. Leicester sank to his knees, tugging savagely at the tightly clasped burden, and angry cries rose from the scandalized onlookers. A questioning, threatening ring formed round him, then shrank back in recoil as he shrieked out one hideous word. Lady Barbara heard the word, and saw the crowd race away like scattered sheep, saw the prince forcibly hustled away by his attendants. Also, she saw her son lying prone in an agony of overmastering terror, his spasm of daring shattered by the child's unexpected resistance, still clutching frantically as though for safety at that white satin gewgaw, unable to crawl even from its deadly neighbourhood, able only to scream and scream and scream. In her brain she was dimly conscious of balancing, or striving to balance, the abject shame which had him now in thrall, against the one compelling act of courage which had flung him grandly and madly onto the point of danger. It was only for the fraction of a minute that she stood watching the two entangled figures, the infant with its woodenly obstinate face and body tense with dogged resistance, and the boy limp and already nearly dead with a terror that almost stifled his screams, and over them the long gala streamers, flapping gaily in the sunshine. She never forgot the scene. But then it was the last she ever saw. Lady Barbara carries her scarred face with its sightless eyes as bravely as ever in the world. But at Eastertide her friends are careful to keep from her ears any mention of the children's Easter symbol. You've been listening to a bite-sized audiobook, read by me, Simon Stanhope. If you'd like to help me to keep producing new content, you can find links in the video description to my Patreon page, or to buy me a coffee. Another way to support me is through my Bandcamp page, bitesizedaudio.bandcamp.com, where you can hear my narrations of many more classic short stories, and you can also purchase and download them to keep. This recording is copyright Bitesized Audio 2023. Thank you for listening.